Well, friends, we got introduced with the terms like narrative persona, and what we say, narratology. Now we shall go ahead with one more term beginning with the letter N, that is narrator, or it can be understood in the context of another term which begins with the letter V, that is point of view. There is a similarity between these two terms and concepts. So I have merged them together in for my discussion for the sake of convenience. The term narrator is used in the context of referring to a person who tells a story. So a narrator is one who tells a story. A narrator is a character who recounts the narrative, or what we call, in other words, a story. So a narrator is the speaker of a literary text. When we understand this term in the context of a work of fiction, it is the narrator who determines the story's point of view. A short while before, I talked about this term point of view, which is correlated to the term narrator. So, therefore, we are discussing both these terms together. A point of view is the perspective from which a story is presented to the reader, and it is the narrator who determines this perspective, or what you call a point of view. So, in simpler terms, a point of view refers to whether a narration is the first person, that is directly addressed to the reader, as if told by one involved in the narrative, or third person, usually a more objective distance perspective. So, a narrator is a person from whose perspective a story is told. In other words, the narrator narrates the text. And there are different types of narrators in the context of uh, a point of view. Now, let's try to understand these different point of views, or different narrator types of narrators. If the narrator is a full participant in the story's action, means if the narrator is one of the major characters in the story, and if he talks about the events and actions in the story, the narrator is described, or the narrator is said to be in the first person. So the story being told is from the first person point of view. A first person narrator speaks from the first person point of view. And the first person narrator's commentary uses the pronouns like I, we, my, our, me, us, mine, ours, etc. And the first person character is a character in the text because he's telling it from his own point of view. Consequently, he is involved in the action of the story, or he participates in it in some or other way. So the first person narrator is a character in the story and can be recognized by his or her use of I. While third person narrators may be limited or omniscient, we are going to talk about the third person narrators in detail in the next part of my discussion. So the first person narrator can only tell the audience what he sees, and he cannot comment on action that he does, or uh, he does not see or experience directly because he is not involved in that action. So that's the limitation of the first person point of view or the first person narrator. The second type of point of view or the second type of narrator is known as a second person narrator or a second person point of view. This is a very rare technique used in any kind of narratives. A second person narrator speaks from the second person point of view, and the second person's narrator's commentary uses the pronouns like you, your, and yours. As I mentioned, it rarely happens in storytelling, in the narration, I can say. The second person narrator is a character in the text because he is telling the story to another person. Consequently, he is involved in the action of the story, or he or she participates in the story in some or other way. The second person narrator can only tell the audience what he sees, just like the first person narrator. He cannot comment on action that he does not see or experience directly. And the second person narrator is very rare, as I mentioned earlier, in literature. One of the examples that I can mention here is found in Edna O'Brien's A Pagan Place, which was published in the year 1973. Another important point of view or another important type of narrators is a third person narrator. A third person narrator speaks from the third person point of view. The third person narrator's commentary uses the pronouns like he, she, they, his, her, their. These are the third person pronouns. His, hers, theirs, etc. And a story told by this narrator, a narrator who is not a character in the story, is a third person narrative. In the former, means in the first person narrative, the narrator is confined to knowledge of the minds and emotions of one or at most a few characters. Whereas in this case, in the third person, the narrator knows everything, seeing into the minds of all the characters from the story, because many times he is not a participant in the story, in the action. There are two types of third person narrations further: the third person limited narrator and the third person omniscient narrator. While talking about the third person limited narrator, we can state that the third person limited narrator is not usually a character in the text because he is removed from the action. It means that the third person limited narrator does not participate in the action of the text. Hence, he is called a limited narrator. The third person narrator of this kind is called a limited narrator because he can only comment on the actions of some individuals involved in that particular action. Means there is some behind the scene action that he does not see, of course. He can comment on whatever he sees. And there can be some behind the scene action on which he cannot comment, or he cannot see, rather, I can say. So his narration is limited from this perspective because he cannot comment on action that he does not see or experience directly. Third person limited narration is not a common type of narrator in literature. The second type of third person narrator is the third person omniscient narrator. You might be knowing the term Omniscient. Omniscient means all knowing. God is omniscient, you might be knowing. One who knows everything is called omniscient. Sarvajna is the Marathi word for omniscient. So the third person omniscient narrator is not a character in the text because he is completely removed from the action and he does not participate in the action of the text. He is called an omniscient narrator because he can comment on everything every character experiences. He controls all these things. Therefore, his narration is omniscient. The third person narrator is someone outside the story looking down at everything that is happening. Third person omniscient is the most common type of narrator in literature. So the two important narrators are first person narrators. The first person narrator is involved in the action, is the participant of the action, whereas the third person omniscient narrator is also used very frequently. The author itself, some many times becomes this narrator who observes everything from outside. Now you can take the example of Ruined Mysteries, Fine Balance or Fine Balance. In this novel, he uses the third person omniscient narrator point of view. So in this manner, we understand different point of views or different types of narrators.